We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Incarceration in Pennsylvania, Then and Now. I want to start by telling you a little bit about why we're doing this program. This is in conjunction with the hot off the presses October 2019 issue of PMHB, which I'm thrilled to say just came in on Monday. So if you are members or otherwise subscribers and you have not yet received it, it should be in the mail and hitting your mailbox any moment now. Otherwise, we're offering it downstairs at half off the regular price, so $10 instead of the normal $20, just in conjunction with this event. I have the honor of editing PMHB. My name, I should tell you, is Christina Morocco, which means that I've also had the pleasure of working with our three presenters tonight over the course of about 2 years. Actually, it's kind of tremendous the lead time that goes into these special themed issues in particular. So it's really nice, especially to meet those authors whom I hadn't had the chance to meet yet, but I've been emailing with constantly. So I do hope that if you haven't yet received or you are not yet receiving PMHB, that you will grab a copy downstairs. I think it turned out really beautifully. In addition to the three people who have here today, there's great work by our colleagues at APS, at Eastern State, at Swarthmore, just a lot of really cutting edge work that brings the scholarship right up to the present moment. So it's very exciting. The other thing that I hope you'll do while you're here is that we have a document display downstairs in the display cases on the history of incarceration, some of which relates directly to what you're going to be hearing about tonight. So if you haven't done so already, I hope that you'll check that out on your way out the door. So let me go ahead and introduce our first three presenters. I won't read their bios in their entirety, but they are in the program for you to refer to. So first, Tasia Ibram is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research is focused on 20th and 21st century Black literature, history, and culture, with particular interest in Black feminism, prison writings, carceral studies, cultural geography, digital humanities, and Philadelphia Black radicalisms. She's currently writing her dissertation entitled Black Urban Revolution, A Cultural History of MOVE and the Radical Everyday in West Philadelphia, and it is, of course, MOVE that she'll be speaking about tonight. Dr. Beth English is director of the Project on Gender in the Global Community at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination at Princeton University. She's a lecturer in the Princeton Writing Program and an instructor with Princeton University's Prison Teaching Initiative. She received her PhD in history from the College of William and Mary, where she was a Glucksman Fellow and visiting assistant professor, and has taught at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the co-editor of Global Women's Work, Perspectives on Gender and Work in the Global Economy, author of A Common Thread, Labor, Politics, and Capital Mobility in the Textile Industry, and a contributing author to several edited volumes focusing on gender and the U.S. South. Dr. Kristina Brasler-Kolfan is a public historian and scholar of early American social history, teaching and working in the Department of History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Leicester and an MA in modern history from Queen's University, Belfast. And she researches poverty, labor, mobility, and crime and punishment in the early American Northeast, as well as public historical and commemorative representations of the subject. You may have seen on your way in that Kristen was kind enough to provide us with some bookmarks from her brand new book. So I hope that you will pick those up on your way out if you haven't done so, and check it out. And congratulations to her for that. All right. Hello? Hello? I will stay up here and ask questions. That was fun. thing would work is I'd like to give each of the authors an opportunity to talk a little bit about their individual work, and then we have some general questions to talk about the history of incarceration more broadly, and then I do want to leave plenty of time for you folks to ask questions. So starting with Kristen, we're going to go sort of in chronological order with these more specific questions. Kristen, you write about the links between poverty and incarceration in the early American Republic. What did that relationship look like?
The two were basically inextricably linked because essentially poverty was almost entirely criminalized in the 18th and 19th century. This is the period where we still have debt imprisonment, and homelessness is effectively illegal. If you are experiencing homelessness, you're likely to be arrested and incarcerated in one of the city jails in Philadelphia, but certainly elsewhere in other cities as well. So poverty was criminalized to the extent that city watchmen, which is the early version of the 19th century police force, collaborated with the Guardians of the Poor, people who were elected officials designed to run the almshouse and distribute early forms of welfare. They collaborated to arrest people and decided whether they should send them to the jail or to the almshouse. So essentially the two are connected both in how they're conceived by in terms of crime and poverty being conceived of as connected by officials who are managing poor relief as well as carceral institutions. And certainly that process was racialized in the same way that we see today. African Americans were overrepresented by at least 2 times their proportion in the general city population due to that discretionary relationship between overseers of the poor and city watchmen.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up. You know, one of the things that historians of reform are always trying to answer is how coercive or benevolent were these attempts at aiding the poor. Can you speak to that with your subjects a little bit?
Sure. So it's hard to say, of course, always in terms of what the sources are actually telling you, because they will usually claim to be having philanthropic motives. But the fact of the matter is that what you see in a lot of the sources is people experiencing poverty and homelessness being described by the individuals who are elected to care for them and provide them with assistance in order to survive. They're assuming that they were intentionally idle and immoral and connecting poverty with immorality to the extent that they would claim that they did not deserve certain comforts that we might expect in order to survive. And so people who ran, for example, the Arch Street Jail in Philadelphia, which was designed expressly to house vagrants and debtors and people awaiting trial. So people who were not convicted of a crime officially, they had not been tried by a jury of their peers. They were basically left without blankets, without beds. They were given fewer food provisions, fewer visits from the doctor than people who were incarcerated as felons at places like Eastern State Penitentiary. And this was because these officials had a perception that there was a class difference in the type of people who would be reformable and thus worthy of being sent to somewhere like Eastern State where they could actually be provided with, the opportunity to sit and read a Bible, for example, as opposed to likely to just kind of wallow in their own idleness and profligacy is how they were discussed.
Yeah, thank you. I think that this is really one of the revelations of Kristen's work is the fact that the poor were sometimes treated, did not receive treatment of the same quality as people who had been convicted of crimes. I found that really fascinating. Beth,
yes.
You work on, or your work in our volume is on the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory.
Right.
And the subjects whom you explore are primarily PIR shapes or reflects that particular identity in the late 19th century.
Right. So just as a real quick background, the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory was a prison that opened in the late 1870s in Huntington, Pennsylvania, so sort of out in the middle part of the state. And it was conceptualized, and the reformatory movement broadly was conceptualized as a way to fill the gaps in the penitentiary system. There were lapses in Eastern State here on the, on the cover. It was in the 1820s the sort of cutting edge of penology, right? Well, by the Civil War, everyone, well, not everyone, but most prison, people who paid attention to prisons agreed that not a lot of reformation was happening in these places. And so a whole new kind of way of thinking came around called the new penology, and out of this, these reformatory prisons grew. With the idea being that the focus would not just be on punishment, but it would be on rehabilitation. So rather than sort of solitary or solitude, quiet, very regimented work schedules, corporal punishment that was normative in the penitentiaries, the reformatories were going to do something different. They were going to replicate sort of the outside world. Inmates would have access to schooling, classes. They would have vocational training. They would socialize with inmates in the yard. There was a prison band, and so the idea being that the inmates would be able to sort of use their time, their sentence, as a way to kind of relearn how to be good citizens. But what happened very rapidly was this, for a number of reasons, the sort of rehabilitative ideal fell by the wayside, and it reverted, the reformatory reverted into a kind of penitentiary-like space, where the young men, they typically were between the ages of 16 and 30, were subjected to corporal punishment and solitary confinement and bread and water diets and all the things that the reformatory was not supposed to utilize, and a space it wasn't supposed to be. So, as Christina said, the bulk of these inmates were working class, young, working class, largely white at this point. If we think of sentencing disparities, this I think is one moment where we're seeing, sort of a certain sector of society, in this case white, a moderately stable, working class population being diverted into this, what was considered, on the outside to be an easier place to serve a sentence. And, when the men, arrived at this prison and, sort of experienced the, largely disciplinary regime, which I look at, this was something that really flew in the face of norms of sort of working class masculinity, which had a very strong sense of notions of citizenship and duties owed and given to certain individuals, to ideas of respect, of the ability to work. A lot of the identity of the population of inmates at PIR really identified their manhood with being able to do work. And that's consistent, if you look at the white working class population, not only at PIR, but writ large in this period. On the flip side, administrators talked about these young men as individuals who gave up their citizenship rights and who gave up their manhood to a certain extent by virtue of breaking the law. And so you see this real conflict where you have administrators talking about these inmates as they use the terms deviant children. They talked about the lack of self-control they had, whereas the inmates saw, standing up to a guard, standing up to an inmate monitor, to breaking a rule, to breaking a tool in the workshop, as part of their definition of manhood. And so that, so in this space, it's a really interesting case study to look at intersections of class identity and gender identity within the carceral space that was developing in the late 19th, early 20th century. So,
great, thank you. And Tisha, probably most members of our audience are familiar with the 1985 MOVE bombing. That of course is a central event in Philadelphia history, in Philadelphia cultural memory. But you write, at least in the article that you've published with us, about the prehistory of this event, about especially conflicts between MOVE and Philadelphia police in the 1970s. Why is it important to look at this earlier era?
I don't know what happened to my mic, but it's fine. A lot of reasons. I think the first one is like taking the bombing out of isolation as like the spectacular event that we go to, rather than understanding more the kind of complex history that leads up to this moment. So like all of the confrontations before that, and really like focusing on like how violence and confrontation with police was a part of like members' everyday life leading up to that day for years. So that, to illuminate the kind of nuance that preceded that moment. And I also wanted to really have people think about like political incarceration, specifically for Black people who are dissident at this moment. And that being like a real way that the carceral state is forming, like suppressing those movements is a big part of how how mass incarceration comes to be. So thinking of them not just as like, you know, this kind of fringe thing that happened, but like Black radicals are becoming political prisoners at large rates in this moment. So I really wanted to think about that, like their position of confrontation with the state, which doesn't begin or end with the bombing. And then to think about them as like true abolitionists, I guess, and that's language that we have now, that's like acceptable language, like, ooh, we can actually change the way things are. But thinking about the real threat that their lifestyle posed as sort of early abolitionists, like abolishing certain ways that we even understand family, and maybe gender and all these other dynamics and the environment, and then also like policing, saying like, yeah, we don't even think police should be in the community. And so them like kind of initiating that language before it was sort of legitimated language or sanctioned language that we kind of have now. So
I'm really crazy about this term you use that's in your title of the title of your piece about carceral landscapes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these were not just conflicts between activists and the police. This was also about urban renewal, right? And this was about gentrification and institutional growth, and that all of these processes worked together to create these carceral landscapes.
I think, again, like a lot of political prisoners in this moment, I think Malcolm X is one of the first people that says like America is the prison, in the sense that like the conditions he sees in urban spaces before getting into prison are ones of confinement, people not having access to employment and economic resources, social resources, whatever those might be, or being displaced. Like gentrification is another kind of carceral formation, I guess, forced movement of people out of their neighborhoods. So all of these things that sort of coincide with displacing people to prisons or displacing them to other neighborhoods to make those neighborhoods more safe for other groups, whatever it may be, surveillance, policing, all these things happening in the community are kind of, they're carceral. And it's gendered and racialized too. It's carceral, I guess, to have institutions that sort of hierarchize who gets to have access to certain resources based on race or based on gender. So, like normalizing certain identities is also like a carceral way that our world is.
Well, that actually leads perfectly into a question I wanted to ask all three of you, which is to zoom way out and discuss a little bit, what do we mean when we talk about a carceral space? How narrowly or how spaciously do we want to define this term? What sorts of different categories are there? And why is it important that we do or don't make these distinctions?
I would define carceral space really, really broadly because for a few groups of people, so the Articles of Confederation, going way back, 1777, they granted, in Article 4, they granted free ingress and regress across all state lines to everyone, except vagabonds, paupers, and fugitives from justice, who were not granted that freedom of movement. So they were denied the very right that the entire creation of the United States as individual states was meant to provide. The microphone keeps turning off, I'm sorry. So I would define a carceral space as any space that is doing that is circumscribing somebody's ability to make decisions about where they want to go. As you're saying, about your own neighborhood being forcibly removed from these areas, having the state intervene and make decisions on your behalf about where you have the right to move and to be.
And I think for, in the context of the reformatory movement, one of the key elements of the kind of program around it was that incarcerated individuals, once they were released, they weren't just released. That there was a whole system of parole that developed during this moment. So this is when we get this notion of state oversight of convicted individuals after they leave the prison. And so the sort of formal carceral space in this moment in the late 19th, early 20th century is formally expanding. And, initially the sort of police force, if you will, the original probation officers were Pinkertons. They were Pinkerton detectives, which was really interesting because they were also the folks who were labor spies and they were doing all kinds of, nefarious things, in a lot of different places. But the state hired this sort of private police agency, if you will, to keep an eye on and to go out and track down people that broke their parole, bring them back, and then that became formalized into the sort of system of, of parole that we, in, a very overly rigorous and punitive kind of sense of once you've served a sentence, you still have more sentence to serve. And it's very difficult to get kind of, even though you're out, you're not out. And all of the circumscribing that goes on within that extended carceral system outside of the prison walls.
We tend to use the terms prisons and jails synonymously. How, as historians, would you respond to that tendency?
I don't know the actual first. I mean, I definitely, I guess, track in like the cultural historian domain as well. So I feel like the distinction is important. It is important, I guess, to know like where the jurisdictions are. Like the local government is sort of has jurisdiction over the jail, so like they'll be here close by, and then the state is sort of operating in the prisons, and so they're all over the place. So like when I think about people in the MOVE organization, even right now, folks who are still incarcerated from the 1970s, it's like they're traveling hours to go visit, and so then your family becomes like a part of this punishment. Like you have to uproot your life, your family, the day, your resources to even visit a family member. So I think that's a distinction that becomes like, yeah, important in a concrete way. Like again, like the displacement of people from the community entirely, like not just that you're confined, but that you have to be like far from.
And we see that, with my work, we see that exact thing happening because the reformatory was, as I said, sort of in the middle of the state, and it was getting people from literally all across the state. So, you had folks from Erie County and you had folks from, Metro Philadelphia, and they're all being sent to the same place. And, in a time when transportation, was not easy. It really it in some ways undermined its own program by cutting people off from the resources and the kind of support networks, which in many instances, frankly, were already broken, but even just an attachment to a community that's broken even more by incarceration, that kind of undercuts the ability of the institution to do what it says it's going to do.
I wonder, especially putting that into conversation with Tasha's work, if that is not so much a bug as it is the way the system itself functions to interrupt communities and make it more difficult for them to cohere.
Yeah. And then the expectation was that people would go back to those communities. And so it's, you have these years-long breaks, and when you go out on parole, you're supposed to find a job in your former community. Well, how do you do that if you have broken connections there? It makes it very difficult. And so it's kind of straining already strained linkages. And I think that's that starts way before my work starts and goes on obviously way after as well.
It's one of the interesting distinctions about jails in the earlier period as well. So Arch Street Jail, I'm calling it a jail because that's what it is in our contemporary understanding, but in the 19th century they thought it was a prison. They referred to it as a prison. But it was situated deep within the community. It was located at Broad and Arch, so people were constantly milling around it, and it was in a really central location. And so whenever something was going on, riots or an epidemic, anything like that, people gathered around this space. And so jails have this distinction of being much more a part of the community, even if they're behind these gigantic stone walls, as opposed to prisons, which are meant to be, right? Like Eastern State was built on a hill so that everyone was supposed to look up and see that as a reminder, deep far in the distance, not to end up there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We take it as a given that we know what incarceration is for, but I'd like to take a step back from that and have our panelists weigh in on what purpose incarceration has served historically in the eras they study, in the present, if they wish to weigh in on that. Is it about punishment? Has it been about punishment? Is it about rehabilitation? Is it about removing individuals from society or from temptation, restitution for victims? What purposes has it served?
That's the earliest person.
Yeah.
So in the 18th and 19th century, we have this kind of warehousing model for prisons and jails, where people are kind of just thrown into a room and expected to just kind of fight things out. The idea was that they were trying to prevent, and this is something that the historian Michael Morantz talks about, mimetic corruption. That if other people see you doing your criminal activities, they're more likely to then know how to do those criminal activities. And so it was really a put you behind a wall because you did something that the state doesn't want you to do. And so the idea was just to take you out of public view and remove your visible poverty, remove your likelihood to be a thief, remove all of that from public view and prevent other people from participating in similar activities. That's until we get to the penitentiary model, reform model, where it's expected that you're going to have some sort of moral uplift as part of your experience, but that is not the case in small jails and institutions that are meant to manage people, misdemeanors mostly, people who haven't really committed proper crimes, maybe minor theft of food or sleeping outdoors or performing other sorts of subsistence activities in public spaces. So much like we see now, that's what leads to things like being arrested for loitering, trespassing, and policies like stop and frisk.
Kristen, I think this fits into your time period better than our other two speakers. Could you you talk just a little bit about what facilitated the emergence of the penitentiary system? What broader cultural shifts brought that on?
Sure, yeah. So the penitentiary movement, the kind of penitentiary revolution, was a result of dissatisfaction with the existing jail system. And in the Philadelphia context, that's the Walnut Street Jail, which was famous for being a kind of den of iniquity. It was filled with disease. There were people cramped in tiny space and living in horrendous conditions. And it wasn't doing anything to prevent crime in the views of prison officials. And the idea was that if you treat people with dignity, they might do better. They might be able to restart their lives and not go on to commit further crimes. Ostensibly, that's this reform-minded notion that's going on in the context of a whole bunch of other reform movements in terms of abolition, women's rights that come a little bit later, abolition earlier, and all kinds of other conversations that end up leading to things like the temperance movement and all of that. It doesn't really pan out. Eastern State is founded in 1828, I think, and the idea is that unlike in the jail, where you have hundreds of people in one room, seeing each other, talking to each other, learning from each other about their experiences. In the penitentiary, you have a bag placed over your head and you're marched into a cell where you will never see another person who is incarcerated there, so that you can restart your life. When you leave, no one will recognize your face and know that you have been incarcerated. Theoretically, you could see some functions to that in terms of having a different experience follow up after you be in jail in a congregate system.
Thank you. Do either of you want to speak to purposes of incarceration?
Yeah,
go ahead. No.
So many. But I think, at least in the period that I'm kind of thinking about, like the 1970s and really the 20th century more largely, I mean, I'm thinking about like how Black criminality comes to be constructed in so many different ways and changes over time. And I think, again, like after kind of urban uprisings in major cities throughout the United States, like law and order gets a lot of traction. And Philadelphia is definitely one of the places where that happens. Like immediately after riots in North Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo is building up the police force, and he's using the language of like making sure this doesn't happen again to do that work to get people to consent to that project. And the same thing goes for like Black students who are calling for Black studies programs in the city, and the Black Panther Party and the Revolutionary Action Movement, all these groups, he's sort of building this campaign around them, and I think that's happening in other cities. So that's playing a major role. And MOVE kind of comes after that moment, like after, I think, in Philadelphia, the assumption is like, okay, these groups are gone. Like the status quo is, instated again. And they sort of disrupt that by coming along like in 1972, but really in the mid-70s. So I think it served that function for sure, like not having people break the status quo, Black dissidents, other people on the left, and definitely displacing those folks, displacing Black poor people, displacing poor people, especially as like more money is coming for the city to be like, have service industry and become like a real growth machine, if you will. So yeah, a lot of things, and capital. People supplying food, supplying different resources that the prison needs, and a lot of money, private dollars flow through prisons, and I think anti-Blackness has created a lot of profit throughout our country's experience. Prisons are one way that continues to happen. So yes, displacing people who don't necessarily matter in society.
Among the many really interesting things that you've just said, it jumped out at me that your work has something to say about the chronology of social movement history vis-a-vis the history of the growth of conservatism in the 1970s, because it shows that it was neither a steady decline on one hand or steady growth on the other, but rather this sort of halting, contingent set of processes, this tug of war, and I think that's really fascinating.
So just from my perspective, or sort of positioning the reformatory movement in its time and space, if you think of the moment in which the sort of thinking around the reformatory was happening, it was in a moment of really incredible disorder. Right after the Civil War, conversations around what do we do with freed slaves, what do we do with what do we do with a kind of nascent radical, working class. Industrialization, massive, the first massive waves of non-Northern, non-Western European immigrants began coming into cities on the East Coast. And so you have all of these kind of elements of disorder happening. And the reformatory, in much the same way it was kind of a response to the disillusionment with the penitentiary system, it was a response to a lot of this disorder. And the thinking around it was that this would be a state institution. This is also a time when conceptualizations of what the state should and shouldn't be doing in individuals' lives is really in flux. And so the idea is that this carceral, they didn't use the term carceral then as much as we do today, but this idea of a carceral institution that would kind of fill a gap. Like there was a vacuum in order, and families weren't providing stability, communities weren't providing stability, the workplace wasn't providing stability, and so this would be a space that would provide a certain degree of stability and rehabilitation for people that got off the track, right? Who kind of lost their way and did things that were not in line with ideas of kind of late 19th century citizenship. And so in that way, it's it's kind of part of that removal, right? Get people out and into an institution that's going to function in a way to create stability, whatever that means, in order for the society that exists in that moment.
So I think one thing that's come out very clearly in all three of your answers is that when we're talking about the purpose of incarceration, there of course is always the ostensible stated purpose and then the implicit purpose. And covering that, of course, is one of the important things that historians can do. I'd like to get down to more of a material level. When we look at inmate populations, how they've changed and grown over the years, and the actual lives of those individuals when it came to access to food, access to health care, work regimens, disciplinary regimes. What would you say about how those aspects of people's actual lives within carceral institutions have changed?
Colonel, how'd you think?
So in some ways, you can see change in that we have this movement from, the congregate cells to the smaller penitentiary model cells, and then back to the giant model, and then back again. So in that way, we see change over time in terms of how people are being expected to live in relationship to other people when they are incarcerated. But one of the things that I think is really, really important to remember is continuous throughout this period, which is labor, right? The expectation that prisoners will labor for little or no compensation, that they are basically having labor extracted from them as part of their carceral experience. And this applies to people who are being incarcerated, not for committing a crime, but again, for exhibiting the facets of being a person experiencing poverty, which the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in jails and prisons, especially in the 19th century, are fitting into that category. So the exploitation of labor continues, as does poor conditions being used to coerce behavior. within prisons. So this absolutely happened in the 19th century. People were waterboarded in the Maryland State Penitentiary. People were held in darkened cells on bread and water in Philadelphia city jails and prisons. There are a lot of things that are overlapping, in particular related to mobility. So most people who are convicted for vagrancy have some element of movement as part of the reason why they've been incarcerated. Maybe they don't have legal settlement in Philadelphia, and so they've been arrested and placed in the jail because they can't figure out what to do with them until they can remove them back to wherever they have legal settlement. Migrants, then and now, are also being placed in these kinds of facilities, and we've been hearing reports of what the conditions in those spaces is like. And last winter, if you recall, in the news, there was a federal detention facility in New York, in Brooklyn, I think, that had reports of having no heat and very little medical care being provided. And the descriptions that were coming from people incarcerated there are almost identical to some of the things that I've seen in the late 18th and early 19th century. So, tiny bit of change and movement and a whole lot of
I would just say I concur with you. In my study, that was a really key part of the kind of the friction between the inmates and the administrators, is that there was a certain expectation of a degree of predictability and a degree of we're at least going to be fed. If we're ill, we're going to have medical treatment, and that really was not there. On top of the fact then that the punishment regime that was supposed to be sort of you behave, you get extra time in the yard or whatever, sort of a system of you do well, you get more privileges, you don't get those privileges. So it's sort of an incentive-based system. And what they got was solitary confinement, for months at a time. The men, and this, in many ways, again, was very counterproductive because the men in the institution, they filled that gap for themselves. And so when in a cell block, if someone was ill and they weren't being cared for, the inmates themselves were caring for that individual and kind of stepping in and filling that role, and that just even more created these kind of bonds of mutuality and reciprocity that that sustained both the inmates and their day-to-day experiences, but also the continued sort of battles that went on between the inmates and the administrators who were tasked, by the state with a certain level of control over those inmates.
I think, I just wanted to refresh myself, and there was something like 7 state prisons in 1970, and now I'm sure there are more than 25 now, but there were 25 in 2017. And so just the massiveness and the investment in prisons, SCI Phoenix is $1 billion prison, I think, and that's brand new pretty much, and just shuttling prisoners there, and obviously creating either the conditions, the social conditions or the material conditions to fill those prisons and criminalize certain behaviors and what have you. So just the largeness of it. And then I'm doing oral history work with my dissertation, which wasn't heavily present here just because it's ongoing and it depends on who's being released from prison. But one of our participants was telling me that SCI 1C, which is a women's prison, didn't have gates around it in 1981 when women got there, and now it does. So just I don't know what to say about that. Other the carceral structures, the literal architecture of the institution is being made stronger. Just to think of the visual aspects of prisons too, it wasn't there was a huge epidemic, women were just running away because the prison's in the middle of nowhere already. Nature acts as its own kind of boundary, but then to build up the gates, I guess is kind of another added punitive aspect, like yes, you are enclosed in this structure now. So that's something like really like literally tangible that shows us the direction that we're going in. And I think kind of the racial tension, segregation, violence, all of those things are still an issue in prisons, and maybe we can understand that more in the 1970s, but it's definitely like it's alive and well and kind of like being facilitated, I think, by folks that are administrators and guards in the prisons, and so that is another aspect, I think, that also mirrors our society.
We have not talked about money in the prison system, and I apologize, this is not something I asked you to think about ahead of time, but why so much money? Where is this funding coming from? What is the relationship between prisons and profit, and how has that changed?
Yeah, I was just thinking the other day about like, just like what it costs to make a phone call. Like for someone who's incarcerated to make a phone call, to send a letter, and vice versa. Like, it's actually like an investment to do this work, like to send letters to folks in the organization who are incarcerated. So like, it's like those small things that are like recreational or contribute to everyday life, but like there's profit right there, like there's money, capital moving and making the system work, and also like making people wealthy, corporations wealthy, and the state. They're working together. So yeah, like any little thing we can think of that makes the prison run on a daily basis. Somebody supplying it, is being outsourced, it's being cable. Like they're paying somebody to provide cable when they could funnel that money into a community or a household or a school, so that there's no need for like prison cable. You can have the money somewhere else.
Yeah, I teach with the Prison Teaching Initiative at Princeton, and we are part of the consortium of institutions that offer for-credit accredited college classes for incarcerated students from teenage years up to old age, if you will. And one of the things that struck me the very first time I went in to teach my first class was sort of exactly what you're talking about. Like, and what brought it home to me was we have to carry everything in clear plastic bags, right? And you would watch people coming in and out, going through security. And every single one of those people had some sort of clear plastic bag. And then, people would come in and they would have their makeup case in a clear plastic case, and they would have their lunch in a clear plastic case. And it's, and it got me, I'm thinking, there's this billion-dollar industry around clear plastic, toting devices to satisfy the security needs of going in and out of these institutions. And I think that, in many ways, you have that at the same time that, I know Eastern State, and I'm not really sure about the earlier period, but, Eastern State and then the Reformatory period, where you have, a sense that, labor is going to help pay for the costs of incarceration. And in the Reformatory, sort of turned that on its head and said, well, labor is going to be a source of education. It's going to be a way of rehabilitation. It's not going to be a way of profit. When we look at the records of the Pennsylvania Reformatory, and this is replicated elsewhere, that literally within a few months of opening, you have the superintendent writing to the governor saying, I need to set up a chair shop because we don't have any money to feed these guys, and we need some kind of industry that's easy to learn, that you can have a lot of guys doing it in a small space. And so like immediately, and so that idea of work for rehabilitation immediately fell by the wayside. And then at the same time, you have the state saying to them, well, you should just be able to pay for yourselves, we're not going to budget. And so this idea of especially trained guards and teachers and a lot of the things that would have, historians are in the business of saying, well, what if? But if all of those things had been in place, how would that system have functioned differently, and would it have been more successful and able to do what it said it was going to do in theory versus just kind of becoming almost another penitentiary with some very minor details that were different?
I would add that there's money in the policing aspects as well. It's one of the things about, I won't speculate on the 21st or late 20th century, but certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, we've seen that the numbers of arrests far exceed the length of time served because people are arrested and then released after a week. They're supposed to spend 30 days. They're released after 7 days. Then they're re-arrested again, and then they spend another 7 days because the city watchmen and the constables are pocketing the money for each arrest. They get paid per head, not by wage or hours or anything like that. So they have a vested interest in policing more people and arresting more people. And so they're making money at that stage. And then the jail is also making money off of the labor who are incarcerated. So it's kind of just a big circle.
Yeah, taking Beth's comment about the clear plastic bags, clear tote bags and backpacks and so forth, and tying that back to our earlier discussion about thinking capaciously about communal spaces, today, I see school children on the subway carrying clear plastic backpacks, and a lot of them, I think it's mandated that they have to do that, so there is very much that seepage. So we've talked about generations upon generations of reformers who have each looked back on the previous generation and said they failed at what they said they were going to do. We are going to right this ship and enact true reform. And it never seems to work. Now, Tisha referred to MOVE as abolitionists. Why is it that ideas about changing the structure of incarceration have so often been limited to reform, have so often been limited to bettering conditions within the prison system and other kinds of incremental change, and not to looking outside the prison system entirely?
Another big question.
Yeah. You can answer it.
But, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know that people can really imagine transforming the society as it is, and I guess that's real yeah, that's not super concrete, but yeah, I think we have limited vision for that, but also folks benefit from things being the way that they are. At least some people do benefit, even in ways that we don't even necessarily know, or having the privilege and benefit of not having to think about how we benefit, from maybe a rural community getting a prison in their community and maybe bring more profit or money into their space at the expense of another community who lost all the things that are in the prison, or just the hierarchies, the racial and gender hierarchies that stay in place when we have a carceral society. So I think enough people benefit that abolition doesn't even come onto the table really, but yeah, also the world could be different. We also had slavery and it ended, thank God, and people had to visualize oh, this isn't the world as it is. This isn't just, it just isn't like this. It got constructed, and we can also take it apart, and that also means thinking of something to come in its place, and that requires work. Yeah, and if we are saying the system's economic, it's racial, it's all of these things, it has to do with certain people being in poverty and this and that. We also have to think about yeah, what can come in its place, changing the society, changing the social parts of the society and also like materially, where will we send resources instead to make this not the reality, so, yeah.
I think in the case of the reformatory that I looked at, and I looked at a particular moment when there was an investigation done of the abuse that was going on in the prison that sort of blew up into this, you know, into a news story when word got out. There just happened to be one very sort of dedicated dad that brought this to a state senator who happened to be passionate about this, you know, about this situation, and then he brought it to the governor and it turned into a whole thing. But you know, at the end of the day, even that state senator who you know, initiated the investigation, he was very dogged in terms of uncovering the truth. You know, lots of days and days and days and days of inmate testimony and depositions of parents whose sons had died in the institution, all kinds of stuff. You know, at the end of the day, the blame for the conditions in the institution was placed at the feet of the inmates. And so it wasn't the system, it wasn't the thinking around the way the reformatory was structured, it wasn't the appropriations, it was that we're dealing with bad guys. Come on, we're dealing with lawbreakers here. We're dealing with deviant children, as they called them, right? We're dealing with brutes, they called them brutes. So it's not a problem of the system, it's the people that we're dealing with. And I think that there's this tendency to, you know, when we think of carceral reform, that if we can just tweak the system a little bit, you know, just enough, it's going to fix that, it's going to fix the element to get those who are within the system in line. And that has never played out well, right? You know, from start to finish. And, but, you know, that kind of thinking of, well, it's not the system, it's the inmates, fundamentally, and that's happened over time, I mean, in successive waves of reform, that it really circumscribes the possibilities for broad institutional and structural change. So the thinking remains within the prison versus kind of exploding out of it and thinking of broader community level kind of social programming that would address many of the issues that brought people into those institutions in the first place.
I would just add to what wonderful things you two just said, that it's hard to reform something that is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And in particular, looking at, you know, one tiny jail in a sea of carceral institutions, the state of Pennsylvania investigated the Arch Street Jail in 1832 after many people incarcerated there died during the cholera epidemic. And part of their investigation was, why are the conditions here so terrible? Why did so many people die? What's going on the inside? They talked to people incarcerated there, they talked to guards, they talked to city officials, and what they concluded, and this is 1832, they said that the character of some of our laws, as well as their mode of administration, disadvantageously affects the poorer portions of the community. And they did nothing to change that. The poor law stayed on the books. Continuously, the institutions continued to operate, the conditions remained the same because of, I think, all of the factors that Tisha outlined.
I would ask one more question to our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to audience members. So, we are historians, of course. We look at the past, but I think we do have to address the fact that the single defining characteristic of today's carceral system is racialized mass incarceration. What should we as historians do to confront that situation?
Yeah, I think make the call to people, like take the work into like, what is the next step? What is the action behind what I just said? What's the future-oriented part of this work? Like we're going to history to understand something about what we're gonna do in this moment and what's before us, so. Yeah, and I don't think like our disciplines always demand that, just like, yes, get in this archive, see what happened and write about it, but like, okay, and what does the archive require of us, which is to like, yeah, suggest something new based on what we found, so, yeah.
And I think we can find, we can look at instances in the past and see parallels. I mean, obviously they aren't going to be exact, right? Because time and place and all different things, change circumstances. But, we can look at, instances in the past that are very similar to things that we're dealing with now and say, okay, what was happening in that moment? What was sort of the outcome of that, right? And then did it work or did it not? And if it did not, and usually it does not, what are the alternatives that, it kind of gives you a moment to reflect and say, okay, well, this was a moment when this happened, the result of it, A happened, the result of it was B, but C, D, E, and F could have been options. And to kind of think about our C, D, E, and F options now. We already know this one doesn't work. So which ones might work? And I think that that's what, a historian has the ability to kind of step back and give that space and look at, particularly illustrative moments that can, aren't predictive necessarily, but do give us a hint at what may or may not be feasible options for reform or for addressing, community level issues or dealing with culture, normative cultures that are detrimental, in a widespread way. And it just gives us that kind of buffer in some ways to think, to look back and to think and to assess.
Historians spend a lot of time being worried about being seen as subjective, right? So I think that that's part of why we have to ask ourselves this question is it inherently political to say, here are the historical origins of this contemporary issue? And it may be, but I think that it's an obligation. If we are the ones who are in the sources and have the evidence to say that every single generation has repeated these choices, we have an obligation to intervene. And I would just say I think there's a lot of ways to do that don't necessarily involve advocating for a particular political position. One particular thing that's happening in Philadelphia right now is Representative Chris Rabb in the state legislature is working on legislation to document, using historical research, all of the times that the state of Pennsylvania has passed legislation, created policies that have disenfranchised African Americans, in order to think about the possibility of one day achieving state-based reparations if it's not going to happen at the federal level. That is a way that historical research can be used for a real demonstrable utility. And I think that thinking creatively about how we can use the data that we collect, qualitative and quantitative, is a way toward thinking about the role that we can play in conversations like the racial disparities in incarceration.
Great. So I'm going to come around with a hand mic, if I can locate it. Thank you very much. All right. Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your work. A quick thought for Teja that occurred to me as you were talking about the fact that you are contextualizing what happened with MOVE, not just looking at this iconic, if you will, moment in 1985. During the 1970s, when all this buildup, if you want to call it that, is going on, at the same time, we have the IRA having the same sorts of issues across the pond. And even though the race issue, put the race issue aside, we just have two groups of people in a very similar situation, and using political activism, broadly defined, to try to make their point. So that just kind of occurred to me while when you were talking about what your work is centered on, this contextualization. I think it's amazing. Thank you. And a quick question for our other two panelists. In these ideas of reform, in your research, did you find that people looked back at the Lock Hospital in London, which was because venereal disease was criminalized, and this idea that the women who were incarcerated there were supposed to follow a moral standard and then eventually get jobs? Thank you.
Not expressly that particular institution, but most certainly all of the people who I'm looking at in terms of city officials and lawmakers in 18th and 19th century Pennsylvania are very, very interested in what's happening in England with regard to penal practice. And in particular, also, going back even further, the colonial poor laws and prison statutes and everything governing the carceral practices in early Pennsylvania and across the Northeast is derived from British law. The Elizabethan vagabond codes are imported to Pennsylvania and New York. So there's absolutely this deep awareness of what's happening in England, in prisons and in policing.
And I would say same in the period that I'm looking at, particularly with Ireland, though, not so much with England. The Reformatory movement was very strong in the northeast United States and Ireland. And, the notions of, what was interesting is that the folks that were talking about this, quote unquote, new penology were not really talking about morality per se. But they weren't, in some ways they were using coded language. They would talk about things like self-control, and they would talk about things like, again, sort of, notions of respectable citizenship. And part of that was comporting oneself along with, certain gender norms, and that meant, for the white male working class, being in a stable marriage, having a breadwinner, breadwinner husband, and those were very much tied into notions of morality and sexuality, and what you did and didn't do in your personal and also your sort of public activities.
Greetings, I'm Jasper Jones Bayell. I'm a Cherokee Indian and ambassador of the local tribal government, and uniquely, I'm also the fellow program manager ever since the stop of the 92 rebellion in South Central Los Angeles. Philadelphia is one of my cities. I came to this because I knew it would be recorded, and I'm listening to you, and you haven't properly defined the problem. The problem is, in 1492, when the Crown came here, they claimed here to bring us slavery, theft, and death. In 1492, there were no prisons. No poverty, no pollution, the medicine man was free, education was free, there were no taxes, we hardly had no crazy people, and the problem that we're having is until you define the problem, which is modern day crown slavery, we moved from plantation slavery to prison slavery. So we have school to prison and prison to prison as a form of slavery in our time. Until you deal with the fact that this is coming from crown corporations, and what we need to do is dismantle modern day crown slavery, you can't solve the problem because you haven't properly defined it. In terms of the American Indian people, our Constitution, by the way, is actually a translation into English of the protocols of the Iroquois Confederation. And again, the mission of that Constitution is to make the people who came here have the same lifestyle that we had, which was no prisons, no poverty, no pollution, no taxes, medicine man free, education free, and very few crazy people. And in 1492, there was no such thing as race. It's an invention of the crown so that the vassal serfs and slaves would fight one another because they kept defecting to the indigenous government, because once you defected, you would no longer be a vassal serf or slave to the crown. That's what this is really about. So we need to get that on the table. That's why I came here. Because this is being recorded. So we need to wake people up, because we have the opportunity now to end modern-day slavery, which is what the school-to-prison pipeline and prison-to-prison pipeline is. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Marjorie Jones. I'm an adjunct professor of history in Villanova's college program at Grateford and Phoenix Prison. And before I moved to New York, I was an adjunct professor of history at Sing Sing Prison. I have two questions and a comment. Procedural question, does the Princeton program grant degrees?
They do, not through Princeton. We're part of a consortium called New Jersey NJ STEP, and the courses that Princeton specifically teaches are accredited through Raritan Valley Community College. And so we are volunteer instructors in the larger sort of state consortium, and for our classes, RVCC is the accrediting institution.
Gives the degree?
Yeah.
Does it give a degree?
It's a degree that students can earn associate's degrees, they can also earn bachelor's degrees.
So the Villanova degree is a bachelor's degree, as it is at Sing Sing.
Mhm.
But my substantive question is, I'm frankly somewhat surprised that 4 women historians haven't talked about gender. And certainly how women prisoners, how women incarcerated people have been treated throughout history. Anything in history is women are treated differently than men are. So I'd be interested if any of you have focused your research on gender issues. And finally, a comment. If I'm not mistaken, the word penitentiary comes from the Quakers. And the idea was that if people were held in isolation, they would become more penitent. So there's the Quaker influence on the whole history, I'm sure you're aware, of incarceration as well. But if the gender issues interest me, I don't believe that anyone can make the same assumptions about women and men, male prisoners. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in on that. So my broader sort of scope of research, I look at kind of cultures that develop out of certain classed institutions, and that include some of my work. I've looked at women workers and sort of social networks that have grown out of sort of kind of common workspaces. What was interesting to me about the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory, and the article really my article delves into this much more deeply, is that there were these very gendered notions of what masculinity was and what femininity was in this moment. And that, men have gender too. It's not just women that have gender. So, when we think of, how gender functions and sort of how it was, notions of gender were developing in the late 19th century when this prison was really kind of being conceptualized, and the whole reformatory system was being conceptualized. It was very much geared toward a notion of gendered roles in society. And so, going back to what I had mentioned earlier, the idea of the male as breadwinner ideal, a woman as a helpmate, a homemaker, responsible for the productive and reproductive labor of the home. And you see that reflected in male reformatories and female reformatories. And so when you look at the kind of trainings, if you will, vocational training that takes place in these spaces, in the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory, it was things like brickmaking and farming and carpentry. And in, Estelle Freeman wrote a study quite a long time ago on women's reformatories in Massachusetts. And her, and she looks at, and it's the domestic arts, right? And so you have a very gendered, you have a kind of non-gendered conceptualization of what rehabilitation looks like, but then in practice, it falls into these gendered categories of how you get to that particular ideal of how men and women are supposed to function as, as productive members of society.
I also would point to the article which deals with gender a lot more deeply, but the most important thing to know, especially about some of these early jails, is that they were not separating by gender in any sort of effective way. The spaces were so small, there were so many people crammed into these facilities that women and men were mingling, and sexual activity was being policed as well inside of these spaces. But one of the larger things that I think is really important to note, Arch Street was a jail that was built to house vagrants, and we tend to think about vagrancy in the context of the 20th century, right? Like rail riding hobos in the 1930s. But when we go, and those are generally single white men, right, in our kind of popular imagination. When you go back to the early 19th century, you find that there are as many women who are participating in the same activities and who are being incarcerated for vagrancy, almost equally. About 45% of the population of Arch Street was actually women. And they were being punished as harshly as men. They were not receiving the kind of comfortable treatment that some of the early facilities that were expressly targeting women received. So the other factor with this is that as the state was trying to punish mobility through vagrancy policing and pauper removal and these kinds of things, they were using patriarchal definitions of settlement and of citizenship. And so a woman could actually be, who's a widow, maybe she's been widowed 20 years, she's in Philadelphia, but her husband had a legal settlement in Pittsburgh. She will be transported by a constable back to Pittsburgh because that is where her husband had a legal settlement. So gender and patriarchal definitions in law are absolutely a part of this story, so I'm glad that you mentioned that.
And I think as well, it depends on where you're looking at and what kind of carceral system you're looking at. When you were talking, it brought to mind Tabitha LaFloria's work on women convict laborers in the New South. And one of the things that she talks about is how that system in many ways was designed to strip women of gender, to degender them. And that was part of the system, that was part of the racialized system, that was part of the gendered system that existed as part of that broader convict labor system in the New South. So it depends on where you're looking, and I think we're looking at very specific times and places, relative to Pennsylvania, which makes it in some ways a different and a more narrow story.
Yes to thinking about gender. My article definitely does, and I think, yes, thank you for the question. And I mean, it does get, I think, complex when we're talking about Black women specifically, so having that sort of being doubly marginalized, if you will, and simultaneously, so like it's not Black or woman, but like both of those experiences at the same time, and then adding politicized, radicalized on top of it. So that's 3 marginalized or oppressed positions that I see working around and against women in particular. So in the article, I'm thinking about their experience even before getting into prison, but their encounters with police and with the welfare department in Philadelphia. So like being policed and surveilled and having their children taken is another carceral issue. And I think being outside of heteronormativity, patriarchal ideas, and about, what is normative, because they're already in this kind of collective family, but also by virtue of them being Black women, there's so many instances where their children are taken because they're at City Hall and they're protesting, and that now today, like, that's the most mundane thing. You go to City Hall, you say what you have to say, and you go home. But these are the instances where they're being beat by police. Even though they live in a collective family, the children are being taken out of the home full of adults, and they go days going back and forth with the welfare department for a multitude of reasons based on the department's documents, but essentially this is a pattern. Like, it's not just happening to women, it's happening in Philadelphia more generally and in other cities, that Black women are kind of being sanctioned essentially for their status as Black women. Not getting the same protection, so like Black communities being under police, but when Black women are reporting domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, whatever, like also not getting the protections of the law at the same time that they're being over-policed. And then sexual violence in prisons. I mean, I have not heard that specifically from prison, but they've lived in prison at Muncie and Cambridge Springs a long time, and folks are definitely experiencing sexual violence that's going unsanctioned and unaddressed. So, yeah, those are just a few things. Yeah, and when we think about Ramona Africa, I mean, after the bombing, she goes to prison. So again, not getting the protection of the law, even though like the law comes down in this ridiculous way, it's extra legal. And then she also doesn't get the protection of like, okay, well, you're a victim, you lost your entire family. Like, she also is punished for her own limitations. So, yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing all of you. And each of you used a phrase that really triggered some thoughts in me. You used the word marginalized. You referred to disenfranchised. And you said the hope for responsible citizenship. And through the ages, when individuals have been released from incarceration, they've lost their ability to vote. I would think that that's a basic issue of citizenship or responsibility or marginalization. And if they are to be included in society and have a say in society, to know that that was taken away from them by the system would tend to destroy their ability to work within it. So I'm curious to hear your responses.
There's so many ways that citizenship is stripped. So yes, the vote is one of them. Apparently, like sometimes there's fees you have to do when you come from prison. So it's like pay us for your confinement. And yeah, the whole reentry process is just like ridiculous. And I'm still like figuring out what it even is, like at this exact moment. But yeah, just speaking about like people in particular, like folks who've been in prison for 40 plus years, they're coming out in their 60s and 70s and being told like, get a job. Where? In a digital world that now they have to learn and navigate, and also like in what community when the community has moved, or you know, Powhatan Village looks vastly different. Cows Creek, all these places don't even exist anymore, and so I think it's also a thing that like some people come home and they go home, like you could actually go to the physical place that you left, and some people come home and the entire neighborhood isn't even there. So yes, voting and just like coming back to society is like it's almost not even a thing. So it's like the aftermath of if you can get to the aftermath, it's like there are all these other hurdles, financial, economic, geographic, that, yeah, are there.
I think the suffrage question gets to the question that Christina asked earlier about what the real function of prisons is. And I think that our choice nationally to disenfranchise people who have committed felonies and serve their time proves that we want to do more than just extract some form of, you know, exclusion for a couple of years and then move on, right? We want this to be a permanent stain on their lives. So I think that that's pretty clear. The other thing I think is interesting about how that connects to reentry, what you're talking about, is that in some ways, reentry was actually more generous. Like, what's coming from the prison system was actually more generous in the 19th century, which is not to say it was good, but certainly that what you expect now is way worse. You know, Eastern State in the early years actually gave people enough money to get back home, and their sentences were shorter, so their family might even still be there. They might be able to get a job, which we now have a completely different structure for.
And I think that shift starts to happen in this moment of the reformatory when you begin to see things like parole. parole. I'm thinking probation and parole. When you have, an incarcerated individual go back out into their communities, but they're marked in some ways, right? By virtue of having to report back and having to have their boss write a letter every certain amount of time to the superintendent of the prison. So, there are all sorts of different levels of surveillance, I think, that come in addition to stripping rights, sort of overtly saying, you are separate. Which I think is absolutely right. In the earlier penitentiary moment of the early 19th century, the conditions were incredibly harsh, and you could be, you would be let out and you might be sent home, and what would you do then? But there wasn't a sort of whole surveillance and financially punitive, process by which you had, or hurdles you had to get over, even, beyond once you served your term.
This will be the last question.
Thank you for speaking. It was really nice listening to you tonight. I was wondering, you were talking about the morality and the reasons behind incarceration. Just wondering, as to the creation of vice squads and the FBI kind of beginning to police its own people, and that role, also those two things, and what role they played a part in, and if they can speak to the purpose of incarceration and imprisonment as well. If you know.
So the role of the FBI, essentially, okay, sorry, I was trying to write it down, but, yes, heavily present, at least in this moment, and also like obscuring itself in an interesting way, but I mean, I guess like COINTELPRO is like the biggest example, essentially like infiltrating the Black Panther Party and other arms of the Black Power movement and its groups. Infiltrating meaning like forging letters between leaders in the party. The Black Panther Party produced a newspaper that was pretty much like destroyed in transit to different cities. Sending all kinds of technologies to militarize police, which is what we saw happen at the Move bombing. I mean, that is like, that's violence on a scale that shouldn't even have been made possible. But like, how did the Philadelphia police get a C4 bomb? I don't know. But I do know, like, they're definitely working with the federal government. Even though that doesn't come into view in the story of the bombing, it absolutely is happening. The FBI files are there. They're surveilling Move from the 1970s. And those dollars coming into the local governments for the militarizing the police, like Brazil's definitely using that money. There's all the civil disobedience squad in Philadelphia is a clear example of that. And they're doing a lot of most of the surveillance around Move at protests. They're there taking notes. The journalists are taking note of the civil disobedience squad, taking note of Move. So there's a lot of surveillance. They're building their case over time. So by the time we get to the bombing, it's like, they feel like, there are all these things to kind of cite, whereas like they should have had, I think, the free space to challenge the police. A lot of infiltration, and it's a powerful tool because people have to figure out that it's happening first and then address it. By the time it's happening, I mean, as far as the Black Panther Party, they're white, pretty much. Yes.
I think in terms of the moment that I look at, morality is part of a lot of the men that come into the reformatory are arrested on property crimes, basically larceny, theft, those sorts of things. But in their intake records, what's very interesting are the questions that are being asked of them. And they ask them things like, do you go to church? How often have you visited a prostitute? Do you smoke? Do you drink? And the idea, the whole reformatory system is based on, and it never really executed on this, but it's based on this idea that the more you know about an individual, the more you can individualize their care in the institution, and the more that they will, make of their time there. And so what's interesting is that, and they ask things like, do you have any known hereditary mental disease in your family? Do you have, so they're asking questions, not things like, although they do say, where do you live? What kind of job do you do? They aren't getting at those kind of structural community and kind of socially structured things that might lead someone to go and rob a storefront and get some money. But they're asking questions that get to the question of, are you a moral person or are you not by X definition? And I think that comes to shape the way in which inmates of this particular institution, and I don't know that I can speak more broadly than this, but are perceived. And so if you say, I smoke, I drink, I've been to a prostitute a couple times, that shapes how they are going to be perceived within that institution right off the bat. And that's part of their intake record. And then they do another one of those as part of they do those as part of their parole as well. And so it's like this constant surveillance of behavior that's tied into these notions of gendered morality.
The morality issue is really, really important for vagrancy and all of these other kinds of really petty crimes that end up being punished really similarly. In the same docket for Archduke Jail where people are being arrested for vagrancy, you're also seeing people who are incarcerated for swearing a specific number of profane oaths. So there will be 7 profane oaths, 3 profane oaths, and you'll be incarcerated for that. So the city watchmen are really engaged in this policing of morality. In other cities, they're also using vagrancy laws to punish sex work. So prostitution actually falls under the types of activities that count as vagrancy in cities like New York. Philadelphia has its own statute for that, so that's separate. But certainly temperance and other sorts of disorderly conduct are that term, which we see so often in terms of what kinds of really small misdemeanors people have in their records, especially in communities that are heavily surveilled, comes back to this moment in the early 19th century where police are coming into existence in part to monitor and punish those kinds of behaviors.
All right, well, this was fabulous. I'm so glad that I had a chance to hear from you. I'm so glad that you folks got a chance to see these really brilliant minds at work and previews of what's included in the issue, which I do hope you will pick up if you don't have it yet. And we'll read their articles as well as the other wonderful work that is in there. Please also, on your way out, take a look at the document display that we have downstairs. If you weren't able to do so on your way in, I think you'll see a lot of connections between what we spoke about here and what we pulled from the collections. Thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you especially to our wonderful presenters.